Now, time to say a very, very good morning to Dr. Rakib Ehsan from the Henry Jackson Society. Rakib, how are you doing?
Morning, Mike. How are you?
Yeah, very well indeed. Very well indeed. Interesting piece you've written this week for CapEx about racial equality and how it's not really being achieved, but not because of the way most people would think it's not being achieved. Tell us about it.
Well, I wrote two pieces, Mike, one for CapEx and also one for the Telegraph. And it was basically looking at the problem of white working class teenagers being left behind and the poor educational outcomes within this particular section of the youth population. And the main points I made in both pieces was that when we're looking at the areas they're from, they tend to be from coastal, seaside towns and former industrial communities which have truly been left behind, and they suffer from high rates of family breakdown. There's also been the disintegration of shared civic institutions, and these are the kind of things that aren't being talked about as much as they should, perhaps because we have these woke intersectionality frameworks where being seen as white, especially being a white male, is seen as a form of hyper advantage. But when you actually look at educational outcomes, Mike, it's white working class boys which are being left by the wayside. And people, I feel that there's too many people in the political classes, they're not willing to engage with this problem at all.
No, exactly right. And what's interesting as well about the way that you've described where the worst cases of this can be found is in a lot of sort of seaside communities. And I mean, I myself know quite a lot of the communities around Britain. For one reason or another, Hastings is very, very poor and run down. Blackpool is another place where there's an awful lot of terrible kind of social housing and very bad styles of life. And then you've got places on the Norfolk coast as well. Why do you think it's so prevalent in those places?
Well, some of those places that you mentioned, Mike, they've been fundamentally left behind. They've been starved of meaningful public investment for decades. So you mentioned there, Great Yarmouth, Blackpool, Hastings, Thanet would be another area that springs to mind. And what's really interesting, Mike, that recent research has also shown that these are what we could identify as divorce hotspots. So you could say that the material deprivation and the economic downturns in those coastal areas, they're placing a strain on families. And I think that is feeding into relatively high rates of family breakdown. And the reality of the matter is, Mike, family structures play an important part of youth personal development, whether it's school attainment, cognitive development, mental health, emotional well-being. But it's unfashionable now, Mike, to talk about the social value of marriage, or how useful it is to have stable family units, and rather that the heavy impact that family structures have on these kind of important youth outcomes. And unfortunately, I find that in some progressive quarters, they're so concentrated on being inclusive, and they want to say all structures can work. But the research shows that there's certain family structures which fare better when it comes to these kind of outcomes among our young people, especially white working class children.
Yeah, I mean, also there's more of a prevalence, it would seem to me, in those seaside communities of a white population, because an awful lot of the inner cities, of course, are very much more diverse in terms of the different ethnicities that live there. But going around the coastlines of Great Britain, you don't really find an awful lot of diverse mixing of different ethnicities, do you?
No, not at all. I'd also make the point that this is also a problem when we're looking at white working class kids being left behind. Uh, what doesn't get talked about very much is how this is also a problem in rural communities, Mike, which are geographically isolated. So, for example, Devon and Cornwall, all too often by the mainstream media, is portrayed as idyllic, peaceful, affluent counties in the southwest of England. But within those two counties, Mike, there's very serious forms of material deprivation and family and community breakdown. But that doesn't receive much attention at all.
Yeah.
The point I made in the pieces is that when you look at pupils on free school meals, white British pupils on free school meals, they're falling behind their peers of Chinese, Indian, Bangladeshi, and South African or Black African origin, who are also on free school meals. And I think the issue there is, or rather, we need to talk about the cultural factors there, is that irrespective of socioeconomic status and affluence, there are many South Asian and Black African communities. They include parents who relocated to the UK. One of the main reasons was to provide their children with greater educational
Mm.
opportunities. Like, so they're very concentrated on instilling, a strong sense of self-discipline and aspiration within the household, and they're more likely to take the stable family units in these communities. They're more likely to take a genuine interest in their children's educational development as a result of
Mm.
that.
Well, in that case, then, from what you're saying, is it not the case that the white kids' parents or the white working class kids' parents who are falling behind because their parents are not doing that?
Well, I think that there needs to be a discussion, and I think that this is a really good starting point. We need to discuss the effects of family breakdown, especially in deprived seaside towns, former industrial communities, and geographically isolated rural communities. And we need to talk about household culture, the extent to which education in itself is seen as a productive path to take in terms of employment opportunities. I think the big point I'd also make, Mike, is we're talking a lot about the academic route. I think that what we need to do more generally with our own, education system, we need to create a more multi-route education system where we promote vocational education. So we have we have these German style vocational institutions as part of a broader skills revolution in the country. And part of that also has to be high quality apprenticeships. But the key here is looking at cultural attitudes within particular communities, the family structure within these communities, and how this can then be reflected in social policy, which leads to more productive outcomes in terms
Mm.
of youth development.
Yeah, because I've always believed that the wrong approach for a lot of this stuff is to kind of continually subsidise people, to continually kind of just throw money at things and set up youth centres and set up, ping pong clubs and places like that. What you really need is to create a sense of aspiration. And I was wondering, actually, because of your mentioning of the seaside communities, whether fishing as an industry, which Britain now wants to build up, could be part of that, where you could actually get kids trained up to be in the fishing industry in all manner of different ways. Because one of the things that we hear all the time is that we allowed our fishing industry to die around our coastlines because we basically gave it all away to the French and the Spanish. However, if we are going to build up the industry, why not get the local people to make that a job opportunity?
Absolutely. I think that part of the, if we have the kind of how you could say sort of local economic regeneration in those coastal communities, a big part of that will be trying to regenerate regenerating the traditional fishing communities there. But ultimately, the key is being aspirational, hardworking, and self-disciplined in whatever sector you're in. If you have those kind of values and you have that kind of life approach, more likely than not, you will progress in
Mm.
life for sure.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I think that's very much handed down from family to family, isn't it? From parent to parent. Because I was going to ask you whether there's any evidence that you know of where you could compare and contrast, for example, first generation immigrant families coming from the places that you've mentioned, but also maybe second and third generation ethnic minority families who have been here a while. I mean, I suppose what I'm saying is, do they kind of level down, if you like, once they've been here a while?
Well, I think the point I'd make is when we look at certain communities, some communities are more intergenerationally cohesive. And I think this was a big part of the pieces that I've recently written, is that, there's a great deal of wisdom that can be transferred down generations. And I think that's certainly the case in certain communities. But I think more generally, we live in a society where in the social mainstream, loneliness among the elderly is a serious problem. So I do think those intergenerational social bonds, they have broken down, and they can be potentially a rich resource in terms of cultural capital, transfer of knowledge, transfer of traditional conservative values that actually gives younger people a sense of rootedness, which is essential for their personal development.
Absolutely right. And as far as the way that that other kind of public monies are spent, I suppose. I mean, there's all manner. When people talk about racial equality, they don't normally talk in your terms, Rakib, about the poverty and the white working class problem. They talk about, how unfair it is on ethnic minorities who don't have the same opportunities. I mean, that's been the narrative that we've had literally for the past year, isn't it?
Well, I'd make the point that some of the things that we're discussing in this conversation now, Mike, belonging to a stable family unit, being part of a supportive local community, which takes a genuine interest in the progression of their young people. Those are very meaningful sources of advantage, which are thriving in in a number of ethnic minority communities, especially British Indians, as we know, very upwardly mobile, socioeconomically successful. But then we look at the white working class kids, but especially white working class boys, who live in sort of geographically remote coastal and rural communities, where they may come from dysfunctional family units. They may be part of local communities which are atomized and don't take much of an interest in their development. So I think we need to look at inequalities and disparities through a more family-centric lens, and through a more community-oriented prism. Otherwise, I think we're missing a big part of the broader picture.
Mm. Absolutely. And you wrote earlier in the week as well about the left in America. Let's just finish with that, because obviously they've got all sorts of problems in the US now. The idea that Joe Biden suddenly gets elected and it all gets solved is proving slightly more difficult than they thought, I think. But, you've warned about not addressing and not kind of adopting too often the left's views from the United States of America.
Absolutely. I think that would be a real mistake for the contemporary British left to import the kind of the sort of the woke thinking which is taking place within the American left. I think that would be a very serious error. I think that President Biden himself, even though he's tried to promote this message of unity and cohesion, he's come up with things. For example, there's going to be specific economic relief for African American, Hispanic, and Native American businesses. But it's very clear to me that there's many white-owned businesses, especially in the industrial Midwest, which have also struggled a great deal during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, and I think more generally, we have to understand that there's a very different culture there in the United States. There's different legacies surrounding the issue of race. So I think just to import these kind of almost a divisive cultural politics from the United States, I think it'd be very harmful for social cohesion in the UK. And the reality of the matter is, Mike, in the UK, the vast majority of ethnic minority people, while they want opportunities to be improved, they don't expect favors. The vast majority place importance on their British national identity, and they're satisfied with life in the UK. So I think to import those kind of culture wars from across the pond would be a real mistake for the modern British left.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Great to talk to you again. Dr. Rakib Ehsan from the Centre on Radicalisation and Terrorism at the Henry Jackson Society. Find his stuff in the Telegraph, in CapEx, other places as well, the Spectator, from time to time.